At the risk of sounding redundant, which I will, for the benefit of the witnesses, there are two very significant committees, the Commerce Committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee. There are 9 committee members on both committees, and we always have our meetings at the same time. So the disadvantage is you get, we're not sure, you missed all, or I would miss, in this case, all of the opening statements and what questions have already been asked. So that's one of the problems that we're going to try to get the leadership of both committees together to try to rectify, since we deal with very similar subjects. Let me go ahead and just cover something that may have been covered. Stop me if it has been. Mr. Grobman. Cybersecurity is enhanced when products are built from the ground up, protected from cyber attack, instead of trying to impose cybersecurity protections after the product has been developed. I think we understand that. And unfortunately, there are not always strong market incentives for companies to build products from the ground up with a focus on cybersecurity, which has encouraged sentiment for hard regulations to force the integration of cybersecurity into the development of consumer products. So can you, first of all, say, do you agree with that as a problem? And can you speak to the harm that structured, hard regulations would have on cybersecurity innovation?
Absolutely. To the first point, one of the big challenges that we see is sometimes the attack on a device isn't going to harm the individual that purchased the device. So in the case of the Mirai attack back in October, although a consumer purchased a DVR, they weren't the ones harmed when that DVR turned and attacked Dine and then provided denial of service against Spotify, Twitter. So there would be a natural sentiment to look for ways to regulate the way you build those devices. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that we see with hard regulation and cybersecurity is, given the threat landscape continuously changes, being overly prescriptive on how to build a device can make it so that companies are focused on being compliant and removing opportunity cost they would otherwise apply to addressing the most critical threats of the day and end up making their device less secure. So our recommendation is to focus more on a framework very similar to what we've done with the NIST framework that can provide a blueprint for manufacturers to ensure they're looking at the key areas, but be flexible enough so that it's constantly tracking the latest threats of the day, and that the manufacturers and organizations always have the ability to focus on the most profound threats versus specific elements that are imposed in a regulation.
So what you're pointing out is that, yes, it is true that if you have to do this, but if you do it to that detail, they'll forget what the real purpose is, whether it's safety or other elements. Do the rest of you agree with that kind of a...
If I could add, Senator,
yeah.
I completely agree with Mr. Grobman. What is important is, because cybersecurity is so dynamic, if you try to do hard regulations, it's sort of like closing the barn door after the horse is bolted, because you're fighting the last war instead of the next war. So I think it's much better to have guidelines and visibility and flexibility and let the market forces determine.
Okay,
the right
no,
solution.
that makes sense. That does. That's good comment. Some of you talked about the value of the public and private partnership. Usually you're talking about government and industry. However, as was brought up by Senator Cantwell, the universities are getting involved now. And it happens to be that the University of Tulsa, and some of you are aware of this, have won the Southwest Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition for the second year in a row. Any comments you make about the inclusion of programs like that one that's been very successful in Tulsa University? Yes, sir.
Well, I was very disappointed to see their win because they lost against they won against my alma mater, Rochester Institute of Technology. But that aside, all kidding aside, I think it's really exciting to see these kind of competitions. And
yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
Well, because part of what we have to all understand in this, right, is that in order to be good defenders, we have to understand how offense works. We have to understand both sides of the game. And this is a great way to give students the opportunity to learn, to do something a little bit different. And interestingly enough, we're trying now to take this, frankly, to adults as well, which is why IBM has built a cyber range in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to give people the opportunity to practice and rehearse not just the technical side of this, but how to deal with regulators, how to deal with unhappy customers, how to deal with the press and media post-breach. I mean, I would argue that in many, if not most breaches we see, the response to the breach often causes more damage than the breach did itself.
Yeah, and you would agree that you are actually in this program leading some of these young people into that career.
Absolutely. This is actually one of the reasons why we have been active sponsors of these types of university competitions.
Yeah, and we appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.